So you decided to write a paper on why the SEC has not approved an ETF yet. Something that's come up a lot. And actually, Bitcoiners have mixed feelings on this. Some people absolutely don't give a shit about an ETF.
Sure.
Don't want it. Some people do. The one side of the argument is that an ETF would open up the opportunity for more people to have exposure to Bitcoin. Other people would argue that it breaks some of the kind of founding principles of what how you should interact with Bitcoin. Why did you decide to write this paper? What was it that appealed to you in writing this?
When you listen to the detractors of Bitcoin in Washington, a lot of them are saying we need more investor protections. We need more consumer protections. This technology is it's dangerous. There's so many scams, and we're not going to support the growth of this technology until there's better investor protections and better consumer protections in place. So I think the whole spot Bitcoin ETF debate really exposes that Washington doublespeak. Because if you are really someone who wants to see better consumer protections for the millions of people who own Bitcoin in America today, the easiest way, the best way to provide those investor protections is to allow retail investors to have access to a regulated product, which is the spot Bitcoin ETF. So if you're saying, well, we want investor protections, but then you block the means of getting there.
Why do you think they've allowed futures ETFs but not spot ETFs?
Well, it's not logic and reason.
Nope.
I can tell you that. There's a lot of conspiracy theories that have showed up on my feed over the past month or so since we've released the paper. It's hard to say why. I mean, some of the conspiracies or theories that I've read is that the SEC knows what this would do for Bitcoin. I believe when we do get a Bitcoin ETF, and I say when because it's inevitable we will, it's just when, it's going to open up potentially trillions of dollars of buying power on Bitcoin because you have all the money that's sitting in brokerages under, financial advisors, a multi-trillion-dollar industry. There's a lot. We know there is a
wall of money.
There's a lot of pent-up demand for exposure to Bitcoin through the brokerage. And we know that because there's many other ways people are getting indirect exposure to Bitcoin today by buying things like shares of MicroStrategy, which is indirectly like a way to get exposure to Bitcoin, or buying the Bitcoin mining indexes, or GBTC, or other indirect ways to get exposure to Bitcoin. So I think the SEC knows that this would take Bitcoin to a whole new level of adoption, and they're blocking it.
So they're politicking.
It is absolutely politics.
Yeah, so Gary Gensler is an interesting character. He showed up as somebody who was educating people on blockchain. Was it at MIT? He had a course.
Yes, he was a professor at MIT.
So he turns up at the SEC, somebody who seems to clearly understand Bitcoin and clearly understand the difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum.
Oh, yes, absolutely. He's very smart. He does understand this at a technical level.
And assumption is, without knowing, that he has some bags of Bitcoin, I assume. And it joins an SEC with a very pro-Bitcoin Hester Peirce, who I think is a real ally to the industry in a fair way. I believe, having interviewed her and spent time with her, her belief is that she understands what freedom means for Americans. She sees Bitcoin as a freedom technology. She believes they should have access to it. And then everything I see from Gensler is one individual who's holding back the free choice of people to buy and have access to a Bitcoin ETF based entirely on his career aspirations. That's my outside observations of this character.
Yeah, maybe. So he was asked under congressional testimony earlier this year by in Senate banking by Senator Toomey, who's the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee. Why don't we have one? Or he was asked a question about Bitcoin ETFs, and his response was, and this is not verbatim, but he said, he wants to have oversight of the Bitcoin markets. And if he had that, he'd be more comfortable with moving forward with the Bitcoin ETF. So first off, Bitcoin is a commodity. Chairman Gensler has said that as well. So he agrees Bitcoin is a commodity. It's under the CFTC's jurisdiction, different agency. So he's saying he wants jurisdiction over this.
So he wants the exchanges regulated under the SEC.
Yes. Yes. And only Congress can really give him the authority to do that.
What's the complexity there in that there's been people have been very clear that Bitcoin is a commodity, but shitcoins are very clearly securities. An exchange is dealing in one commodity. So you list any like Coinbase, Gemini, Kraken.
Right. So they have Bitcoin plus other cryptocurrencies. So how does the registration regime work?
A commodity, multiple securities. Whose jurisdiction is it? Multiple jurisdictions?
Yeah. So I've had the opportunity to meet directly with Chairman Gensler just in the past couple of months, as well Chairman Benham, the chair of the CFTC. So I had the opportunity to ask them privately and directly some of the conflicting statements between the two agencies, where Chairman Gensler has said Bitcoin is a commodity, but he thinks everything else is a security. And then CFTC Chairman Benham has said Bitcoin and Ethereum are commodities, and then there's many other cryptocurrencies that are also commodities without specifically naming them. So asked Chairman Gensler, so how does the private sector navigate this? And you look at exchanges who have the listing of multiple tokens, they're getting different statements from two different regulators. How do you move forward? And this is one of the most I think important regulatory debates for the industry happening in Washington today. And it's clear that the way the exchanges are regulated today is going to change.
How do you think it's going to change?
So what I understand to be, and I can't speak for Chairman Gary Gensler, but what I understand to be his agenda is he has said multiple times that the exchanges need to come in and register. But then you ask, well, register as what? Because they're not ATSs, they're not national securities exchanges. So what is how do they register? What do they register as? And so I believe he is working on building a whole new type of registration for crypto exchanges, crypto markets that will have, and he's outlined this the last time he testified in Senate Banking just a couple of weeks ago. He talked about this dual licensing where you would be registered with both the CFTC and the SEC. So a lot of this is what is being built today in Washington. And there's going to be winners and losers in this process.
What does the registration mean? What is it that he's trying to achieve with these registrations?
If you're registered as some type of exchange, an ATS, a national securities exchange, a crypto market, you're under the SEC's jurisdiction. So that means that everything listed on your exchange has to be registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. So you're subject to the full disclosure regime as well as other laws and regulations. It's the whole SEC regulatory framework.
Do you think the security frameworks are helpful, or do you think we've moved on from because like the SEC rules or the creation of securities goes back like 100 years? I don't know. You will know better than me.
Oh yeah, almost a century.
Are they fit for purpose now, or what purpose do they serve? Is this just investor protection, and do we need protection? I mean, as a libertarian, I'd assume you say no.
Yeah, I mean, from a philosophical perspective, I think we need a solid rule of law. And I think when it comes to making investments, the individual should be responsible for how they decide to invest their money. Like, I don't think the government should be involved in steering people in a direction of what to invest in or not. I think that's a personal decision that needs to lie with the individual.
Okay.
But in order for the individual to have a fair way of doing that, you need a strong rule of law. So if you have bad actors, if you have people who are lying or committing fraud, we need a way to apprehend them. We need to get that out of the system, right? So enforcement is important. And then you also need fair disclosures. So when you're investing in a company or something else, I think it's important that you know everything about that company before you make the investment, so you can make an informed decision. And so that's part of the SEC's purpose. And we detail that in the paper. We go into the 34 Act. So you have the 33 Act and then the 34 Act. The 34 Act details the role of the SEC. And at its foundation, the SEC is a disclosure regulator as opposed to a merit regulator. So a disclosure regulator, meaning the SEC is not picking the winners and losers. They're not going through all the different things that investors want to bring to the public markets and say, okay, we like this Bitcoin thing, but we don't like this Ethereum thing, so you get to go forward and you don't. That's not how that's not how the SEC was designed by Congress. Again, they get their authority from Congress. It's everyone is subject to the same disclosure regime. So if the investor meets the disclosure requirements, then the public gets to decide what they want to invest in. And so the spot Bitcoin ETF is one example where the SEC is acting as a merit regulator.
Okay.
So they're operating outside of their mandate, outside of their jurisdiction. And it's important that Congress reins this in, because if this keeps going, if they continue to act as a merit regulator, this could have implications for the entire capital markets, not just Bitcoin.
Okay. So in terms of Grayscale, I know there's been lots of applications for ETS, but Grayscale and Barry Silbert has been very clear that he is suing the SEC. What's the status of their application, and is there any historical precedent where the SEC has been sued before and lost?
So their ETF was denied. So both Grayscale and Bitwise had spot Bitcoin ETF applications that were denied this summer.
Okay.
There's a lot of history there, and that's what we detail in the paper. But Grayscale has appealed the denial. So it is going to court. It's probably going to be a long process. It's literally just getting started, but ultimately the courts will decide if this goes forward or not, if Grayscale gets to convert into an ETF. But they're appealing on two grounds. One is a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act. So they're for the SEC is acting arbitrarily and capricious. So they're picking winners and losers. They're acting as a merit regulator, not a disclosure regulator. The Administrative Procedures Act are the laws that apply to the agencies, to the regulators themselves. You have to follow a certain process to operate or to bring new regulations or new laws onto industry. So I find it kind of interesting that the regulators are being alleged of not following the rules that apply to them as they're trying to put new rules on all of us. And then the other piece that Grayscale is appealing on is discrimination of issuers, and that they're treating the Bitcoin ETF issuers different than other commodity ETF issuers.
Which goes back to our earlier point that Bitcoin has constantly been set this higher bar in almost every area where it touches government.
Yeah, so this is a very specific example of where Bitcoin is being held to a higher standard. So you mentioned Commissioner Hester Peirce, who is, I think, serves an incredibly important role at the SEC today, because she is who's calling out this bad behavior.
Constantly calling it out. What is it she said? Like, whenever I can't remember what she says, but whenever there's a decision made she disagrees, she puts out one of those...
dissent.
A dissent, yes.
Yeah.
I dissent.
Yeah. In her dissent of Bitcoin ETFs, these denials, she has said, we are holding this industry to a higher standard. So are we going to do this moving forward with all other ETF or other asset classes? What about everything that came before it? So maybe I'll just walk through a little bit of the history of
please
kind
do.
of what exactly I'm talking about. So in 2013, that's when the first Bitcoin ETF application was submitted to the SEC, and that was by the Winklevoss twins. Yeah.
Okay, yep.
There's the timeline right there. So when that was denied,
It took 4 years to deny it.
yeah,
2018.
I guess so.
Wow.
When it was denied, the SEC in their denial stated the concerns of market manipulation, that the Bitcoin markets are subject to manipulation. But in that denial, they outlined the path forward. And it said, but if you had these surveillance sharing contracts in place, then that would be a path to address our concern. So,
And in fairness, the markets were pretty manipulated back then, back in 2013. Although you could argue all markets are manipulated.
But is this the same way they're treating every other
I have no
commodity ETF?
Well, that's what I'm
it's
saying.
not. It's not.
They probably are all manipulated.
Yeah.
But I just remember back in 2013, it was like it was pretty obvious what was going on.
So they wanted these surveillance sharing contracts in place. So in 2017 is when the Bitcoin futures contracts were launched on the CME. So
The top.
So when the CME launched the futures contract, these surveillance sharing agreements were in place. That infrastructure had been put in place. And so then the industry tried again after that to bring in an ETF to market. And so they had met the standard that the SEC had laid out before. And now they said, okay, we have these surveillance sharing agreements in place. Let's try again. And then they got denied again. The industry got denied again. And in the next set of denials, this is not in verbatim, but basically they're saying, okay, you don't have to just have the infrastructure to address market manipulation. You have to essentially prove the market manipulation is not happening. Again, no other industry has been told to do this.
Here's the goalpost. We're just going to put them over here.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so so then the SEC in their denials put forward kind of the criteria of how do you address this issue of proving the market manipulation isn't happening. And they said, we want to see that price discovery is happening on the CME, where the futures contracts trade, not on the Bitcoin, the spot exchanges. And there's 5 Bitcoin exchanges that make up the reference rate for the futures contracts. Kraken and Coinbase and 3 others. They're detailed in the paper. I don't have them
Gemini.
memorized on
Would it be Gemini?
memory. I think
Binance?
No, Binance is not
Probably
in there.
Bitfinex, I'd guess.
Bitfinex.
I don't remember.
Yeah.
There's 5 of them.
Yeah.
So then the industry spent years developing the research to show where price discovery is happening. Fidelity and Bitwise both conducted their own independent studies, and they were able to show with empirical data to a statistically significant basis that price discovery happens on the CME, not on the spot exchanges. And there were 9 reports that looked at the exact same thing. One was an academic study. There was one that had a flaw. They're all in our report.
We will put it in the show notes so people can access it.
But all of that information was provided to the SEC. And then this year, Bitwise and Grayscale had their applications and they were denied. So the goalpost was moved again. So because of the concerns of market manipulation is the inherent issue,
right? Okay.
The inherent concern. And then, I already stated this, but Chairman Gensler was asked under congressional testimony by Senator Toomey why, and he said, well, now I want to have jurisdiction over the Bitcoin exchanges.
That's that. Again.
Which the SEC doesn't have the authority to do that. Only Congress can give the SEC the authority to do that, because they'd have to expand their jurisdiction. So
didn't Ovik talk the other day to us about a new thing that was put in for the CFTC to have jurisdiction
of spot market oversight? Yeah. Whole nother conversation.
Yeah, who was it?
That's the Senate Ag Committee that's introduced that bill.
All right, so it's very clear they just. Do you think they don't want it to happen, or do you think Gensler is just trying to play power games?
So under the previous chairman of Jay Clayton, so the companies who had the issuers who had Bitcoin ETF applications, if you talk to them, they will tell you that they believed they were going to get their applications approved.
Yeah, and Jay Clayton was he was engaging with the industry. I mean, he didn't even come to consensus.
He was engaged. So
Yeah.
the SEC was working very, very closely with the issuers. They were on the final details of bringing these products to market. But then the administration changed, and when
damn it.
Gensler took the helm, the term some of the companies has used is the Iron Curtain came down, and they were no longer in communication with the SEC, and they no longer have a path forward.
Okay, so what are the next steps? Because you're saying this is inevitable. What do you think the steps are to be getting spot ETF approved?
So right now it's going into two different directions since there's the
Legal.
the Iron Curtain at the SEC, and the SEC, it seems pretty clear they're not going to move forward. So now it's going to the courts and it's going to Congress. So Grayscale is the first to initiate a legal action, and the courts will weigh in. And then the other avenue.
Sorry, on that, how independent are the courts on this kind of issue? Are they politically influenced, or are they completely independent?
Well, they're supposed to be completely independent.
I'm aware of that, but is there any, like I say, is there a historical precedent with the SEC being sued, and has anyone been successful?
I assume so. I mean, I haven't documented every legal case against the SEC, but in terms of our industry, I don't think so. I think in our industry that hasn't happened yet.
Okay, and then the other path is
Congress, because all of the SEC's authority comes from Congress. So Congress could pass a law changing the direction that the SEC has taken.
Is there any action? Is there any bills that are being considered for this?
So we have shared this report today with 100 different members of Congress, and we are getting bipartisan support across the aisles.
Great.
I have both Republican and Democrat members who have said they believe this is an injustice and they want a spot Bitcoin ETF to come to market. And so there are pretty significant efforts brewing in Congress to bring oversight to the SEC and to get this to market as soon as possible.